The maid didn't defend herself, and the millionaire apologized to her in front of everyone. The October rain drummed steadily against the tall windows of the Whitmore mansion, casting dancing shadows across the marble floors of the grand foyer. Inside, the warmth of the estate stood in stark contrast to the cold, gray evening outside. Crystal chandeliers illuminated conversations between well-dressed guests who had gathered for Richard Whitmore's annual charity gala, an event that had become legendary among Connecticut's elite. Richard Whitmore, 53 years old and worth nearly $200 million, moved through his guests with practiced ease. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit impeccable, and his smile carried the confidence of a man who had never known failure. He had built his fortune in real estate development, transforming entire neighborhoods and leaving his mark on skylines across the Northeast. Tonight, like every year, his home showcased not just his wealth, but his status as one of the most influential philanthropists in the state. In the kitchen, separated from the glittering party by swinging doors and a world of difference, Elena Rodriguez worked quietly alongside the catering staff. At 28, she had been the Whitmore family's housekeeper for 3 years. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform pressed and spotless. She moved with efficiency, born of experience, ensuring every detail was perfect for the evening's event. Elena had emigrated from Guatemala 5 years earlier, carrying nothing but determination and the dream of building a better life for her younger sister, who was studying nursing back home with money Elena sent every month. She had learned English through night classes while working double shifts, and had earned her position at the Whitmore house through impeccable references and an unwavering work ethic. The guests in the main hall represented the pinnacle of Connecticut society: judges, senators, business moguls, and socialites who could trace their lineage back to the Mayflower. They discussed art acquisitions over champagne, planned winter trips to their homes in Aspen, and wrote checks that would fund hospitals and schools they would never need to use themselves. Among them was Margaret Ashford, a 70-year-old matriarch whose family had owned textile mills for generations, and her granddaughter Jessica, a recent Yale graduate who served on 3 nonprofit boards. There was also Thomas Chen, a tech entrepreneur whose startup had just gone public, and Dr. Patricia Williams, who ran the largest children's hospital in the state. As the evening progressed, Richard found himself in the study with a small group of his closest friends, including his business partner, James Morrison, and Senator David Hartwell, who was running for re-election. They were discussing potential investments when Richard noticed something that made his blood run cold. His safe was slightly ajar. The study was Richard's private sanctuary, lined with first-edition books and original paintings worth millions. But most importantly, it housed his personal safe, where he kept not just valuables, but sensitive business documents and a collection of rare gold coins that had belonged to his grandfather. "Excuse me for a moment," Richard said, his voice tight with concern. He walked to the safe, his heart pounding. Inside, everything appeared to be in order, but as he conducted a quick inventory, he realized that his grandfather's 1933 double eagle coin, worth nearly $500,000, was missing. The coin had been displayed prominently in a velvet-lined case, and Richard remembered seeing it just that morning when he had retrieved some documents. Now, the case sat empty, and a sick feeling settled in his stomach. Richard's mind raced. Only the household staff had access to this room during their daily cleaning routines. The catering staff had been instructed to stay in the kitchen and dining areas. His wife, Catherine, was in Europe visiting their daughter, and their son lived in California. The security system had been active all day, with no signs of forced entry. "James, David, I need you to see this," Richard called to his friends, his voice strained. They gathered around the safe as Richard explained what was missing. The implications were devastating, not just the financial loss, but the violation of trust, the breach of security in his own home. "We should call the police immediately," Senator Hartwell suggested, but Richard shook his head. "Not yet. Let me handle this first. I have a reputation to protect, and so do my guests." Richard's thoughts immediately turned to the household staff. There was Elena, his housekeeper, who had access to every room in the house. There was also Marcus, the groundskeeper, but he rarely came inside. The catering staff were all from a company Richard had used for years, thoroughly vetted and bonded. But Elena was the only one who cleaned the study regularly, the only one who would have had both access and opportunity. Richard felt a surge of anger and disappointment. He had trusted Elena, had even given her raises and bonuses, had recommended her to friends who needed domestic help. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of the theft, but because he had believed in her character. Without taking time to consider other possibilities, without investigating further, Richard made a decision that would haunt him for weeks to come. He strode out of the study, his face dark with determination, and headed toward the kitchen. The sounds of laughter and conversation filled the house, but Richard heard none of it. His singular focus was on confronting the person he believed had violated his trust and stolen from his family. He pushed through the kitchen doors, startling the catering staff and Elena, who was arranging dessert plates with meticulous care. The kitchen fell silent as Richard's presence commanded attention. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying across the room like a whip crack. "I need to speak with you. Now." Elena looked up, confusion flickering across her features. She set down the plates she was holding and approached her employer, her hands clasped in front of her. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore, my grandfather's coin is missing from the safe. The 1933 Double Eagle. You're the only one with regular access to that room." His voice was cold, accusatory, leaving no room for doubt about what he believed. Elena's eyes widened, and she took a step back as if she had been physically struck. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't understand. I would never." "Don't lie to me, Elena. The coin was there this morning, and now it's gone. You cleaned the study yesterday, and you were the only staff member in that room today." The kitchen had gone completely silent. The catering staff stood frozen, unsure whether to continue working or leave. Through the swinging doors, the sounds of the party continued, oblivious to the drama unfolding just yards away. Elena's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure. "Mr. Whitmore, I swear to you, I have never taken anything from your home. Never. I clean your study every Tuesday and Friday, just as I have for 3 years. I have never touched your safe, never even looked at it closely." But Richard was beyond listening to reason. The anger, the sense of betrayal, the embarrassment of being robbed in his own home had clouded his judgment. He saw only what he wanted to see, an employee who had access and opportunity, someone from a different background who might be tempted by wealth beyond her imagination. "I trusted you, Elena. I welcomed you into my home, treated you with respect, paid you well, and this is how you repay that trust." Elena's composure began to crack, not from guilt, but from the devastating realization that the man she had worked for faithfully, whose home she had cared for as if it were her own, truly believed she was capable of theft. "Please, Mr. Whitmore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, you know me. You know I would never do such a thing. I have worked for you honestly for 3 years. I have never given you any reason to doubt me." But Richard was already moving toward the kitchen doors, his decision made. "I want everyone to know exactly what kind of person you are, Elena. I want them to understand what happens when trust is broken." And with that, he pushed through the doors, leaving Elena standing alone in the kitchen, her world crumbling around her. The catering staff avoided her eyes, uncertain and uncomfortable. In a matter of minutes, her reputation, her livelihood, and her dignity had been shattered by an accusation she had no way to disprove. Elena stood there, her hands trembling, knowing that her life was about to change forever. The sounds of the party continued in the next room, but for her, the music had stopped. Chapter 2. Public Humiliation. Richard burst through the kitchen doors into the main hall with the force of a man possessed by righteous anger. The elegant gathering continued around him. Crystal glasses clinked, sophisticated laughter echoed off the high ceilings, and the soft murmur of polite conversation filled the air. But Richard's presence, his visible agitation, began to draw attention from the nearest guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. The room gradually fell silent as faces turned toward him. Curiosity and concern etched in their expressions. Margaret Ashford set down her wine glass, her elderly eyes sharp with interest. Senator Hartwell moved closer, sensing the gravity of the moment. Dr. Williams paused mid-conversation with the hospital board members, and Thomas Chen looked up from his discussion about tech investments. "I apologize for interrupting this wonderful evening," Richard continued, his voice carrying clearly across the marble floors and ornate furnishings. "But I feel compelled to share something with all of you, something that concerns trust, integrity, and the values we hold dear in our community." Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the sound of her employer's voice rising above the party noise. She stood there, partially hidden behind the swinging door, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized what was about to happen. Just moments ago, I discovered that a valuable family heirloom has been stolen from my private study, Richard announced. The gathering moved closer, forming a semicircle around him. Cell phones discreetly appeared as some guests began recording, sensing they were witnessing something significant. The thief, Richard continued, his voice heavy with disappointment and anger, is someone I trusted, someone I welcomed into my home, someone I treated as family. His eyes scanned the crowd, ensuring he had everyone's attention. My housekeeper, Elena Rodriguez, has stolen my grandfather's 1933 double eagle coin, worth nearly $500,000. A collective gasp rose from the assembled guests. Margaret Ashford pressed a hand to her chest, her jewelry catching the chandelier light. Senator Hartwell shook his head gravely, while Dr. Williams exchanged shocked glances with her colleagues. "Elena!" Richard called out sharply. "Come out here! Face these people! Face what you've done!" Elena's legs felt like lead as she slowly pushed through the kitchen doors. Every eye in the room fixed on her as she entered the grand hall, her uniform a stark contrast to the evening gowns and tailored suits surrounding her. She walked with measured steps, her head held high despite the crushing weight of humiliation descending upon her. The crowd parted to create a clear path between Elena and Richard, forming an impromptu courtroom with no judge, no jury, and no presumption of innocence. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft patter of rain against the windows and the distant sound of classical music from the sound system. "Look at her," Richard said, gesturing toward Elena as she stood alone in the center of the room. "Look at this woman who I trusted with my home, with my family's most precious possessions. 3 years I employed her. 3 years I paid her well, gave her bonuses, treated her with kindness and respect." Elena stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her dark eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond the crowd. She did not fidget, did not look around desperately for support, did not break down in tears. Instead, she maintained a quiet dignity that seemed almost otherworldly in the face of such public humiliation. "I have security footage," Richard continued. "Though he didn't, I have evidence, and when the police arrive, they will find the proof they need to prosecute this theft to the fullest extent of the law." Jessica Ashford, Margaret's granddaughter, shifted uncomfortably. Something about the scene disturbed her, the way Elena stood so calmly, the way she didn't protest or defend herself. But the young woman remained silent, unwilling to challenge a man of Richard's stature in front of such distinguished company. Thomas Chen found himself studying Elena's face, looking for signs of guilt or fear. Instead, he saw something that surprised him, a profound sadness, but also an unwavering composure that spoke to an inner strength he hadn't expected. "Elena," Richard addressed her directly, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "Do you have anything to say for yourself? Any explanation for this betrayal?" Elena finally lifted her eyes to meet Richard's gaze. For a moment, the entire room held its breath, waiting for her response. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the grand hall. "No, Mr. Whitmore, I have nothing to say." The simplicity of her response sent ripples through the crowd. Some guests exchanged glances, perhaps expecting protestations of innocence, tears, or desperate pleas. Instead, they witnessed something far more unsettling, a woman accepting her public destruction with grace. Margaret Ashford found herself studying Elena more closely. In her 70 years, she had seen many people under pressure, had witnessed the collapse of fortunes and reputations, but she had rarely seen someone maintain such composure in the face of complete social annihilation. "Nothing to say," Richard pressed, his anger seeming to intensify at Elena's calm response. "No apology, no remorse, no explanation?" Elena met his eyes again, and for just a moment, something passed between them, a look of such profound disappointment that it gave Richard pause. But the moment passed quickly, and his anger reasserted itself. "I want everyone here to remember this moment," Richard declared, turning back to his guests. "Remember that trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. Remember that character is revealed not in moments of comfort, but in moments of truth." The irony of his words was lost on him, but not on everyone in the room. Dr. Williams, who had spent years working with families in crisis, recognized something in Elena's demeanor that troubled her. Senator Hartwell, despite his political instincts to side with a major donor, felt an uncomfortable twinge of doubt. "The police will be here shortly," Richard announced. "I've already called them. Elena will be arrested tonight, charged with grand theft, and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can take advantage of kindness and generosity. Elena closed her eyes briefly, as if absorbing the finality of the moment. When she opened them again, she looked around the room one last time, her gaze touching each face that stared back at her with a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and, in some cases, uncomfortable sympathy. "May I go now, Mr. Whitmore?" she asked quietly. Richard nodded curtly. "Pack your things and leave your keys on the kitchen counter. You're no longer welcome in this house." Elena turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her steps measured and dignified. She did not hurry, did not hang her head, did not allow the weight of their stares to bend her shoulders. She simply walked away, leaving behind a room full of people who would spend the rest of the evening discussing what they had witnessed. As the kitchen doors swung shut behind her, the spell seemed to break. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, but the elegant atmosphere of the charity gala had been irreparably altered. Some guests began making excuses to leave early, while others clustered together, discussing the dramatic scene they had just witnessed. Richard accepted their condolences and support, but even as he played the role of the wronged employer, something nagged at him. Elena's reaction had been so unexpected, so contrary to what he had anticipated, that it left him with questions he wasn't ready to acknowledge. In the kitchen, Elena gathered her few personal belongings, a small purse, a light jacket, the book she had been reading during her breaks. The catering staff watched her silently, their discomfort palpable. She placed her keys on the counter as instructed, took one last look around the kitchen where she had worked faithfully for 3 years, and walked out into the cold October rain. As she stood at the bus stop, waiting for the late-night route that would take her back to her small apartment, Elena finally allowed herself to cry, not for the job she had lost or the reputation that had been destroyed, but for the crushing disappointment of learning that 3 years of honest work, 3 years of mutual respect, could be erased so completely by a single moment of doubt. The rain soaked through her jacket as the bus finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness. As Elena climbed aboard and found a seat near the back, she had no way of knowing that her quiet dignity in the face of such public humiliation had planted seeds of doubt in several minds that evening. She had chosen not to defend herself, not because she was guilty, but because she understood something that Richard, in his anger, had forgotten. That true character is revealed not in how we treat those who can help us, but in how we maintain our integrity when everything is taken away. Chapter 3. The Weight of Silence. The days following the charity gala passed like a slow-motion nightmare for Elena Rodriguez. Her small one-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, 30 minutes from Greenwich by bus, had become both her sanctuary and her prison. The space, which had always felt cozy and warm, now seemed to press in on her from all sides, filled with the weight of her uncertain future. Elena sat at her small kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen as she scrolled through job listing after job listing. Each application required references, and the gap in her employment history would be impossible to explain without revealing the accusation that had cost her everything. Word traveled fast in Connecticut's domestic service community, and by now, everyone knew what had happened at the Whitmore mansion. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Maria in Guatemala. "Haven't received money transfer this month. Everything okay?" Elena stared at the message, her chest tightening. She had been sending $800 every month to support Maria's nursing studies, money that came from her now-lost position. How could she explain that she was unemployed, accused of theft, and blacklisted from the only work she knew how to do well? She typed back, "Small delay. Will send soon. Focus on studies." It was a lie that tasted bitter, but she couldn't bear to crush her sister's dreams with the truth of her own destroyed reputation. Meanwhile, in the elegant neighborhood of Greenwich, Richard Whitmore was discovering that victory felt far more hollow than he had expected. The police had come that night, taken his statement, and opened an investigation. But as days passed without Elena's arrest, without recovered stolen goods, without the closure he had anticipated, Richard found himself increasingly troubled by memories of that evening. He replayed the scene obsessively, Elena's calm acceptance, her refusal to defend herself, the way she had looked at him with what seemed like profound disappointment rather than fear or guilt. He had expected tears, protestations of innocence, desperate pleas. Instead, he had witnessed something that challenged his assumptions about guilt and innocence, about how people respond when cornered. Detective Sarah Martinez, the officer assigned to the case, visited Richard's study 3 days after the gala. She was a 15-year veteran of the force, methodical and thorough, with a reputation for solving cases through careful investigation rather than quick assumptions. Mr. Whitmore, I need to ask you some questions about the timeline, Detective Martinez said, settling into the leather chair across from Richard's desk. You said you noticed the coin was missing during the party. That's correct. I came into the study with some business associates, and I saw that my safe was slightly open. When I checked, the coin was gone. And when did you last see the coin? Richard paused, thinking carefully. That morning, when I retrieved some documents from the safe. So the theft occurred sometime between morning and evening on the day of the party. Yes, that's right. Detective Martinez made notes in her pad. I'll need a complete list of everyone who had access to your house that day. Staff, vendors, guests who arrived early, anyone who might have been in the study. As Richard compiled the list, he realized it was longer than he had initially considered. The catering company had sent a setup crew that morning. A florist had delivered arrangements and spent time throughout the house. The wine supplier had brought additional bottles. A sound technician had installed equipment in several rooms, including the study. Even some early arriving guests had toured the house, as they did every year. Mr. Whitmore, Detective Martinez continued, can you tell me about Elena Rodriguez? How long has she worked for you? Have you ever had any problems with her before? Richard found himself describing 3 years of exemplary service. Elena had never called in sick, never broken anything, never given him any reason to doubt her honesty or integrity. She had even returned valuable items she had found while cleaning. An expensive watch left in a guest bathroom, cash that had fallen behind furniture, jewelry that had been carelessly left on countertops. Has she ever asked for advances on her salary? Seemed financially desperate? Shown unusual interest in your valuables? No, never, Richard admitted reluctantly. She was always professional, always respectful of our privacy and possessions. Detective Martinez nodded, making more notes. I'll need to interview her, of course. Do you have her contact information? Richard provided Elena's address and phone number, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as the detective's questions forced him to confront the reality that his accusation was based entirely on opportunity and assumption rather than evidence. That same afternoon, Detective Martinez knocked on Elena's apartment door. Elena opened it, unsurprised. She had been expecting this visit since the night of the gala. Ms. Rodriguez, I'm Detective Martinez. I'd like to ask you some questions about the missing coin from the Whitmore residence. Elena invited her in, offering coffee, which the detective accepted. They sat in Elena's small living room, furnished with second-hand pieces, but kept meticulously clean and organized. Tell me about your work at the Whitmore house, Detective Martinez began. Elena spoke quietly about her 3 years of employment, her duties, her schedule, her relationship with the family. She explained her routine in the study, dusting the furniture, vacuuming the carpet, emptying the wastebasket, but never touching personal items or the safe. Did you know about the coin collection? I knew Mr. Whitmore kept valuable things in his safe, but I never looked closely. It wasn't my business, and I respected his privacy. Detective Martinez studied Elena's face as she spoke. In her experience, guilty parties usually showed signs of stress, fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, over-explaining, or becoming defensive. Elena displayed none of these behaviors. She answered questions directly, maintained steady eye contact, and seemed more sad than afraid. Ms. Rodriguez, Mr. Whitmore accused you publicly of this theft. Why didn't you defend yourself? Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the gray November sky. Detective, I have worked since I was 14 years old. I have cleaned houses, worked in factories, waited tables. I have been poor, but I have never been dishonest. If Mr. Whitmore, after 3 years of knowing me, could believe I was capable of stealing from him, then anything I said would not have changed his mind. But your silence made you look guilty. My silence preserved my dignity, Elena replied simply. I cannot control what others think of me, but I can control how I respond to injustice. Detective Martinez found herself impressed by Elena's composure and insight. She had interviewed hundreds of suspects and witnesses over the years, and Elena's responses rang with authenticity. More importantly, her reaction to the accusation, maintaining dignity rather than protesting innocence, suggested someone with nothing to hide. Over the following days, Detective Martinez conducted a thorough investigation. She interviewed the catering staff, the florist, the wine supplier, and the sound technician. She examined the timeline more carefully, checking security footage from neighboring houses and nearby businesses. She researched Elena's background, finding no criminal history, No financial problems severe enough to motivate theft, no connections to fencing operations or other criminal activity. The more she investigated, the more convinced she became that Elena Rodriguez was innocent. Meanwhile, whispers had begun circulating through Greenwich's social circles. The dramatic scene at the charity gala had been witnessed by some of the most influential people in Connecticut, and while most had initially supported Richard's position, some were beginning to express private doubts. Margaret Ashford, in particular, found herself unable to forget Elena's quiet dignity. She had mentioned the incident to her personal assistant, who happened to know other housekeepers in the area. The assistant reported back that Elena had an impeccable reputation among her peers. She was known for her honesty, her reliability, and her professionalism. Dr. Patricia Williams, too, was troubled by what she had witnessed. As someone who worked with families in crisis, she recognized the signs of genuine trauma versus manufactured emotion. Elena's response had all the hallmarks of someone experiencing real injustice rather than someone caught in wrongdoing. Even Senator Hartwell, despite his political instincts to support a major donor, found himself questioning the situation. He had built his career on reading people, on understanding motivations and character, and something about Elena's reaction didn't fit the narrative of a guilty person caught in the act. Thomas Chen, the tech entrepreneur, went further than the others. He quietly hired a private investigator to background check Elena, curious about the woman who had maintained such extraordinary composure under such devastating circumstances. The investigator's report painted a picture of someone whose entire life had been built on hard work, integrity, and sacrifice for others. But perhaps the most troubled person was Richard himself. As days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, his certainty began to erode. Elena's refusal to defend herself haunted him. Her quiet dignity, her lack of anger or desperation, her simple acceptance of his accusation, none of it matched what he knew about guilty behavior. He found himself studying security footage from his own cameras, looking for anything he might have missed. He questioned his own memory about when he had last seen the coin. He even began researching the other people who had been in his house that day, something he should have done before making his accusation. Late at night, alone in his study, Richard would sit in the chair where Elena had stood as he destroyed her reputation, and he would wonder if he had made the most terrible mistake of his life. But admitting error would require a kind of courage that wealth and power had never demanded of him. The courage to acknowledge that he might have been wrong, that his assumptions about class and character might have blinded him to the truth, and that his desire for quick resolution might have led him to destroy an innocent person's life. As November rain continued to fall on both the mansion in Greenwich and the small apartment in Bridgeport, 2 lives remained suspended in the aftermath of that accusation, one beginning to question everything he thought he knew about justice and character, the other maintaining her dignity while facing an uncertain future with quiet strength. The truth, meanwhile, waited patiently to be discovered. Chapter 4. The Truth Emerges. 3 weeks after the charity gala, Richard Whitmore sat in his study at 2:47 a.m., unable to sleep for the 7th consecutive night. The room felt different now, colder, despite the heating, emptier, despite nothing having changed in its arrangement. He found himself drawn to this space, almost compulsively, as if proximity to the scene of his accusation might provide the clarity that continued to elude him. On his desk lay a folder that Detective Martinez had delivered that afternoon, containing her preliminary investigation report. Richard had read it 3 times, each reading making him more uncomfortable than the last. The detective had been thorough, interviewing every person who had access to the house that day, checking alibis, examining backgrounds. Elena Rodriguez emerged from this scrutiny with her reputation intact. No criminal history, no financial desperation, no connections to any illegal activity. More troubling were the timeline discrepancies that Detective Martinez had uncovered. The catering crew had been in and out of various rooms throughout the day. The florist had made multiple trips through the house. The sound technician had spent considerable time in the study, installing equipment for the evening's presentation. Several early arriving guests had taken informal tours of the house, including the study. Richard picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for James Morrison, his business partner and oldest friend. Despite the late hour, James answered on the second ring. "Richard, what's wrong? I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Richard's voice was hoarse with exhaustion and uncertainty. "Of course. What is it?" "That night, at the gala, when I showed you the empty coin case, Did you notice anything else about the safe? Anything that seemed odd? James was quiet for a moment, thinking, well, now that you mention it, the safe door was open pretty wide. I remember thinking it was unusual for you to leave it like that, especially with guests in the house. Richard's stomach clenched. How wide? Wide enough that someone walking by could see inside, maybe 6 or 8 inches. Why? I told Detective Martinez and everyone else that I found the safe slightly ajar. But if it was open that wide, Richard trailed off, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. Richard, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that maybe someone else opened that safe. Someone who knew the combination, or someone who forced it open and then left it partially open to make it look like a casual theft. Richard ended the call and immediately dialed Detective Martinez's number, not caring about the hour. When she answered, he could hear the weariness in her voice. Detective, I need to ask you something. Have you checked the safe for signs of forced entry? Mr. Whitmore, it's almost 3 a.m. Can this wait until— Please, this is important. I've been thinking about that night, and I realize I may have made some assumptions that weren't correct. Detective Martinez sighed. I examined the safe 2 weeks ago. There are scratches around the lock mechanism that suggest someone used tools to manipulate it. The person who opened it had some knowledge of safes, but wasn't a professional. They got lucky, or they had inside information about the combination. Richard felt the room spin around him. Why didn't you tell me this? Because I wanted to complete my investigation before drawing conclusions. And Mr. Whitmore, I need to tell you, I don't believe Elena Rodriguez is responsible for this theft. The words hit Richard like a sledgehammer. He sank into his chair, the phone trembling in his hand. Based on what? Based on everything: her background, her behavior, the timeline, the physical evidence. She had no motive, no criminal history, and no means to fence a coin like this. More importantly, the scratches on your safe suggest someone with at least basic knowledge of lock manipulation. Mr. Rodriguez has no such background. Richard hung up the phone and buried his face in his hands. For 3 weeks, he had been living with nagging doubts, but now he was confronting the devastating possibility that he had publicly destroyed an innocent woman's life based on nothing more than prejudice and assumption. The next morning, Detective Martinez received a call that would break the case wide open. The caller was Jennifer Walsh, a nervous woman who worked for Premier Catering, the company that had served the Whitmore Gala. Detective, I think I have information about that missing coin, Jennifer said, her voice shaking. It's about my boyfriend, Kevin Murphy. He was on the setup crew that day, and I found something in his apartment that I think you need to see. 2 hours later, Detective Martinez sat in Kevin Murphy's cramped apartment in Stamford, examining a 1933 double eagle coin while Kevin sat across from her, his head in his hands. Kevin was 26 years old, a part-time caterer who supplemented his income with construction work and had recently been laid off from his primary job. He owed money to several creditors, was behind on rent, and had been growing increasingly desperate about his financial situation. I never meant for anyone else to get blamed, Kevin said, his voice barely above a whisper. When I heard that the housekeeper was accused, I thought about coming forward, but I was scared. I needed the money so badly, and I knew no one would believe a guy like me over someone like Whitmore. Detective Martinez recorded his confession as Kevin explained how he had noticed the safe during the morning setup, how he had returned during the evening when everyone was distracted by the party, and how he had managed to manipulate the lock using techniques he had learned from a friend who worked in security. I thought it would be easy to sell, Kevin continued. I didn't realize how traceable something like this would be. I've been carrying it around for weeks, afraid to try to fence it, afraid to put it back, afraid of everything. Within hours, Kevin Murphy was under arrest, and Detective Martinez was driving toward Greenwich to deliver news that would change 2 lives forever. Richard was in his study when Detective Martinez arrived, the same room where he had made his terrible accusation 3 weeks earlier. She sat across from his desk and placed an evidence bag containing the coin on the mahogany surface between them. We found your coin, Mr. Whitmore, and we arrested the person who stole it. Richard stared at the bag, his hands trembling slightly. Who? Kevin Murphy, one of the caterers. He confessed this morning. He manipulated your safe during the party, took the coin, and has been carrying it around ever since, too afraid to try to sell it. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Richard felt as if the world had shifted beneath his feet, leaving him struggling to find his balance. Elena Rodriguez is completely innocent, Detective Martinez continued. Mr. Whitmore, You owe that woman more than an apology. You destroyed her reputation, her livelihood, and her standing in the community based on nothing more than assumption. Richard sat in stunned silence, the weight of his actions crashing down on him like an avalanche. For 3 weeks, Elena had been unemployed, unable to find work, struggling to survive while he had continued his comfortable life, only occasionally troubled by doubt. "Where is she now?" he asked quietly. "Living in a small apartment in Bridgeport. She's been unable to find work because word of your accusation has spread throughout the domestic service community. She's been blacklisted, Mr. Whitmore. No one will hire her." Detective Martinez stood to leave, then paused at the door. "You know, in 20 years of police work, I've rarely seen someone handle false accusation with such dignity. Most innocent people fight back, protest, demand lawyers. She just accepted it. That level of grace under pressure tells you something about someone's character." After the detective left, Richard sat alone in his study for hours, staring at the evidence bag containing his grandfather's coin. The coin was back, but the cost of its recovery had been immeasurable. He had destroyed an innocent woman's life, revealed his own capacity for prejudice and hasty judgment, and demonstrated to everyone who witnessed that night that wealth and status had blinded him to basic human decency. That evening, Richard called his wife Catherine in Paris, where she was visiting their daughter. "Richard, you sound terrible. What's wrong?" He told her everything: the theft, his accusation, Elena's quiet dignity, the arrest of the real thief. Catherine listened in horror as her husband described how he had publicly humiliated an innocent woman. "My God, Richard, how could you? Elena has been nothing but wonderful to our family. She sent us a card when Sarah graduated. She always remembered my birthday. She took such care of our home. How could you believe she would steal from us?" "I don't know," Richard admitted, his voice breaking. "I was angry. I felt violated, and I wanted someone to blame. She was there. She had access, and I didn't think. I just reacted." "You have to make this right, Richard, immediately. That poor woman has been suffering for weeks because of your mistake." After ending the call, Richard knew what he had to do, but the magnitude of the task ahead of him felt overwhelming. How do you apologize for destroying someone's life? How do you repair damage that goes beyond the financial to the very core of someone's dignity and reputation? He started by writing a letter, draft after draft, trying to find words adequate to express his remorse and his commitment to making amends. But every attempt felt insufficient, hollow, inadequate to the scope of the harm he had caused. Finally, he realized that words alone would never be enough. If he was going to make this right, he would need to do it as publicly as he had made his accusation, with the same courage Elena had shown in accepting his condemnation. The next morning, Richard began making phone calls. He called Margaret Ashford, Senator Hartwell, Dr. Williams, Thomas Chen, and every other guest who had witnessed Elena's humiliation. He called the local newspapers, the society columnists, anyone who might help him spread word of Elena's innocence as widely as his accusation had spread. But first, he had to face Elena herself. Standing outside her apartment building in Bridgeport, Richard felt more nervous than he had ever felt in his life. The building was a modest 3-story structure, well-maintained but worlds away from the elegant neighborhoods where he usually spent his time. He climbed the stairs to the second floor and knocked on the door marked 2B. Elena opened the door, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. She looked thinner than he remembered, older somehow, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worry, but her posture remained straight, her expression calm and dignified. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly. "Elena, may I come in? Please. I have something I need to say to you." She stepped aside, allowing him into her small apartment. Richard noticed immediately how clean and organized everything was, despite the obvious financial constraints. Fresh flowers sat in a simple vase on the kitchen table, and the scent of something baking filled the air. They sat across from each other in her small living room, the same furniture where she had been interviewed by Detective Martinez weeks earlier. "Elena, Richard started, then stopped, overwhelmed by the inadequacy of language to express what needed to be said. "Elena, you were innocent. The police caught the real thief, Kevin Murphy, one of the caterers. He confessed." Elena nodded slowly. "I know. Detective Martinez called me this morning. I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. I accused you without evidence, without investigation, without even giving you the benefit of the doubt that 3 years of faithful service should have earned. I destroyed your reputation, your livelihood, your place in the community, and I did it because I was angry and wanted someone to blame. Elena listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. I can't undo what I did, Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. I can't take back that night, can't erase the humiliation you endured, can't restore the weeks of suffering you've experienced because of my accusation, but I can try to make it right, as much as anything can be made right after such a terrible injustice. What do you want from me, Mr. Whitmore? Elena asked softly. I want your forgiveness, though I know I don't deserve it, and I want your permission to make this right as publicly as I made it wrong. Elena studied his face, seeing genuine remorse and shame where once there had been anger and certainty. After a long moment, she spoke. Mr. Whitmore, forgiveness is not something you can ask for and receive like a transaction. Forgiveness is something that grows over time, when someone shows through their actions that they have truly learned from their mistakes. Richard nodded, understanding that he would need to earn redemption through deeds, not words. But, Elena continued, I appreciate that you came here. I appreciate that you acknowledge what happened was wrong. And yes, I give you permission to try to repair the damage you caused. As Richard prepared to leave, Elena walked him to the door. Mr. Whitmore, may I ask you something? Of course. That night, when you accused me, why didn't you investigate first? Why didn't you consider other possibilities? Richard was quiet for a long moment, confronting a truth about himself that was painful to acknowledge, because it was easier to blame you than to consider that someone from my own social circle might have betrayed my trust, because I made assumptions based on class and background rather than character, because I let prejudice cloud my judgment. Elena nodded, appreciating his honesty. Understanding that is the first step toward making sure it never happens again. As Richard walked back to his car, he carried with him not just the weight of his mistake, but also a newfound respect for the woman whose life he had tried to destroy, and whose dignity had remained intact despite everything he had put her through. The real work of redemption was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Public Apology. 1 week later, on a crisp December evening, the Whitmore mansion was once again filled with guests. But this gathering was unlike any Richard had ever hosted. Instead of a charity gala or social event, he had called together the same group of people who had witnessed Elena's public humiliation 6 weeks earlier, plus representatives from local media, community leaders, and members of the domestic service community. Richard had spent the entire week preparing for this moment, working with his attorneys to ensure every legal aspect was handled properly, coordinating with Detective Martinez to have the facts clearly established, and most importantly, planning how to publicly restore Elena's reputation as thoroughly as he had damaged it. Elena arrived at 7 p.m., driven by Thomas Chen, who had volunteered to escort her after learning of the planned apology. She wore a simple navy dress that Richard had never seen before. She had purchased it with the last of her savings, wanting to face this moment with dignity and grace. As she entered the same grand hall where she had been publicly accused, Elena felt her heart racing. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of party guests enjoying themselves, she saw somber faces, people who had come not to celebrate, but to witness what Richard hoped would be a moment of justice and redemption. Margaret Ashford approached Elena immediately, taking her hands in her own elderly ones. My dear, I owe you an apology as well. I should have questioned what I was seeing that night. I should have trusted my instincts about your character. Dr. Patricia Williams was next, followed by Senator Hartwell and others who had witnessed the original accusation. Each offered their own apologies for not speaking up, for accepting Richard's version of events without question, for allowing social dynamics and assumptions to override their better judgment. At 7:30, Richard called for everyone's attention. The room fell silent as he stood in the same spot where he had made his accusation 6 weeks earlier. This time, however, Elena was not standing alone in the center of the room. Instead, she sat in a place of honor, surrounded by people who had come to show their support. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. 6 weeks ago, in this same room, I committed one of the most shameful acts of my life. I publicly accused Elena Rodriguez of theft without evidence, without investigation, and without giving her the presumption of innocence that every person deserves. He paused, looking directly at Elena before continuing. Elena Rodriguez is completely innocent. The real thief was Kevin Murphy, one of the caterers, who has confessed to the crime and been arrested. Elena has never stolen anything from anyone. She is a woman of impeccable character who has spent her entire life working honestly and helping others. Richard's voice cracked slightly as he continued. I destroyed her reputation based on nothing more than prejudice and assumption. I let my anger cloud my judgment, and I failed to live up to the most basic standards of fairness and human decency. The room was absolutely silent, the only sound the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Elena, Richard said, turning to face her directly, I owe you far more than an apology, but that's where I must start. I am deeply, profoundly sorry for the pain I have caused you. I am sorry for humiliating you in front of these people. I am sorry for destroying your livelihood and your reputation. I am sorry for the weeks of suffering you endured because of my false accusation. Elena sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, maintaining the same composure she had shown on that terrible night 6 weeks earlier. But an apology, no matter how sincere, cannot undo the damage I have caused, Richard continued. Actions must follow words. Therefore, I am announcing several steps I am taking to try to make amends for this terrible injustice. Richard reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. First, Elena, I am offering you a settlement of $500,000 to compensate for the harm I have caused to your reputation and livelihood. This is not charity. It is a small fraction of what I owe you for the damage I have done. Elena's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent. Second, I am establishing the Elena Rodriguez Foundation for Domestic Workers' Rights with an initial endowment of $2 million. This foundation will provide legal assistance, job placement services, and financial support for domestic workers who face unjust accusations or workplace discrimination. Richard looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his peers. Third, I am donating $1 million to the Legal Aid Society to fund a program providing free legal representation for working people who cannot afford to defend themselves against false accusations. The announcement sent murmurs through the gathered crowd, but Richard wasn't finished. Finally, and most importantly, I am offering Elena her job back with a significant raise and the title of household manager, if she chooses to accept it. But I understand completely if she prefers never to work for me again. Richard set down his prepared notes and spoke from the heart. Ladies and gentlemen, what I did to Elena Rodriguez was not just wrong, it was evil. I used my position of power to destroy someone who had done nothing but serve my family faithfully for 3 years. I let prejudice override justice, and I compounded that sin by refusing to listen when my conscience tried to tell me I was making a terrible mistake. He turned back to Elena. Elena, your response to my accusation taught me something about dignity and grace that I had never learned in all my years of wealth and privilege. You could have fought back, could have hired lawyers, could have defended yourself publicly. Instead, you maintained your dignity in the face of injustice, and in doing so, you showed a strength of character that I can only aspire to. The room remained silent as Richard concluded his remarks. I cannot ask for Elena's forgiveness. That must be earned over time through consistent actions, not words. But I can promise that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the lesson in human dignity that she taught me. All eyes turned to Elena as she slowly stood and walked to the front of the room. For a moment, she and Richard faced each other, the same two people who had stood in this same space 6 weeks earlier, but with everything changed between them. When Elena spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the room. Mr. Whitmore, I accept your apology, not because it erases what happened, but because I believe you are genuinely sorry and genuinely committed to making amends. She turned to address the entire gathering. What happened to me 6 weeks ago was devastating. I lost my job, my reputation, my ability to support myself and my family. I spent weeks wondering if I would ever work again, if anyone would ever trust me again. Elena's voice remained steady as she continued. But I also learned something important. I learned that dignity cannot be taken from you. It can only be given away. I chose not to give mine away, even in the face of injustice. She looked back at Richard. Mr. Whitmore, I will not be returning to work for you, not because I haven't forgiven you, but because I have realized that I am capable of more than I ever imagined. Your accusation, as painful as it was, forced me to discover my own strength. Elena smiled for the first time since entering the room. Instead, I will be using your settlement to go to nursing school as my sister is doing in Guatemala, and I will be working with the foundation you have established to help other domestic workers who face injustice." The room erupted in applause as Elena concluded her remarks. Margaret Ashford was the first to stand, followed quickly by Dr. Williams, Senator Hartwell, and everyone else in attendance. The ovation continued for several minutes, not just for Elena's grace and dignity, but for the example she had set of how to respond to injustice with strength rather than bitterness. As the evening concluded, Richard approached Elena one last time. "Elena, I know I have no right to ask this, but I hope that someday, when time has passed and my actions have proven my sincerity, you might consider me not an enemy, but perhaps a friend." Elena considered his words carefully before responding. "Mr. Whitmore, redemption is a process, not a moment, but I believe people can change, and I believe you are trying to change. That is enough for now." As guests filed out of the mansion, many stopped to speak with Elena, offering job references, business opportunities, and expressions of admiration for her handling of the situation. The contrast with her experience 6 weeks earlier could not have been more complete. Later that evening, as Elena sat in her apartment reviewing the documents for the settlement and the foundation, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She had lost a job but found her calling. She had been publicly humiliated but emerged with her dignity intact. She had been wrongly accused but had ultimately triumphed through the power of quiet strength and grace. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting back against injustice, but from maintaining your integrity in the face of it, trusting that truth will eventually prevail and that character, once tested, emerges stronger than ever. The maid who had chosen not to defend herself had in the end defended something far more valuable than her reputation. She had defended the very principles of dignity and grace that make us most human. And in doing so, she had not only saved herself, but had also provided a path to redemption for the man who had wronged her. As the December snow began to fall outside her window, Elena Rodriguez smiled, knowing that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is simply to remain true to who you are, no matter what others may believe about you. In the end, character speaks louder than accusations, and dignity is a choice that no one can take away. Conclusion. And so ends this remarkable true story of Elena Rodriguez and Richard Whitmore, a story that reminds us that our character is revealed not in moments of comfort, but in moments of crisis. Elena's quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation showed us that sometimes the greatest strength comes from refusing to compromise our values, even when the whole world seems to be against us. Richard's journey from accusation to redemption teaches us that it's never too late to admit our mistakes, to confront our prejudices, and to work toward making things right. His public apology wasn't just about restoring Elena's reputation. It was about taking responsibility for the harm that assumptions and prejudice can cause. This story challenges all of us to examine our own biases, to question our quick judgments, and to remember that behind every accusation is a human being deserving of dignity and respect. It reminds us that true character is measured not by our wealth or status, but by how we treat those who have less power than we do. Elena Rodriguez chose not to defend herself that night, but in doing so, she defended something far more important: the principle that our worth as human beings is not determined by what others think of us, but by who we choose to be in the face of adversity. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about the power of dignity and the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their position in life, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it, because in our divided world, we all need reminders of our shared humanity. Remember, character cannot be bought, dignity cannot be stolen, and redemption is always possible for those willing to do the hard work of change. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply maintain our integrity and trust that truth will eventually prevail. Thank you for listening. And remember, in a world that often rewards the loudest voice, sometimes the most powerful response is simply to remain true to who you are.